In this episode, we're going to be covering Season 2, and it's a non-spoiler discussion at this point, so I'm going to try to be as vague as possible, which is going to be really difficult because my score is going to be fairly low. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10, and giving reasons for it do involve a few spoilers, so it's going to be extremely tough. So at this section, for this episode, I'm going to keep it completely non-spoilers as possible, and I'll do just a second part to explain my reasoning as to why it deserves such a low score. But I think I'm not as concerned with the seasons as much as the mythology that some fans are falling into. And again, I don't mind it because, again, fan analyses are fan analyses, but I'm trying to be a little bit more of an expert analysis and not look down upon people. And a lot of things I'm noticing is that people have this idea that seasons 1 to 4 were transcendently great, good, beautiful episodes, but then the decline happened in season 5 or 6, and that's kind of like the debate. When did it really go wrong? But I'd have to say they're not looking at season 2 carefully, because to me that was a huge, huge drop off from season 1, which was incredibly good, which given the budget limitations is pretty amazing that they just really couldn't do a lot that they did in the books. Especially the most notorious one is the throne room, which George complained about, that they never really fully captured the immense size of the throne room and the way it works in the books. And you see some of these limitations in season 2. They really couldn't do almost any battles in the first season, and that really detracted from the sense of the world. You really only got a very partial sense of how huge Westeros or some of the other kingdoms are. And they cure that here, that we do get a lot more. We get to see more places, we see more locations. We do see a few battle scenes, but even the very spectacular battle scene at the very end of the season is really, really small compared to the books. But they've clearly had a huge jump in the budget. They're getting more performers, they're coordinating more people. So the world definitely fills out, and it definitely feels now more like this is Game of Thrones. But one of the things I kept thinking about in doing the review was that, the way the book titles work, it would have made a lot more sense to make book 1 The Clash of Kings and make book 2 The Game of Thrones and have that for the season titles too, because it really doesn't make sense to call it A Clash of Kings, because we only really see 3 kingdoms at most, at least actively vying for power. Right, Dorne is there, but Dorne is basically in the background, and it's good that they give us a lot of the Ironborn, and we get a sense of their culture. But really, they're not really major rivals. This is really about Renly, Stannis, and Robb and how they're contending with Joffrey. And so let me get to the good parts first, and that really is just one word, Joffrey. In the books, Joffrey, to me anyway, is an extremely minor character. He only comes in a couple critical places. He's a great character, but in George's story, he really doesn't do all that much. But, D&D, as much as I'm very critical of them, they made a decision to beef up Joffrey substantially. He is just a huge part of the show and a huge part of the story that they created. And that benefits the season enormously, because when Joffrey's on, there's a huge amount of energy and the story really advances. And we have to, of course, acknowledge that the actor does, most of the work here. But I can't really deny D&D made a critical decision to do that, right? They had to pick the actor, and they had to decide, okay, we're going to focus really on Joffrey and his relationships and how he's solidifying power and how he works with Cersei and works against her and things like that. And that was a great decision. That really, really helps the season. But then the problem becomes that when Joffrey is not on screen, then the show sort of starts to decline and gets a little boring. It gets muddled. And when we switch to Daenerys or to some other people in other places, it doesn't have the same narrative momentum. Also, they make a lot of kind of weird, odd decisions in terms of how they frame people. Like Stannis, to me, is a complete mystery. I mean, when we see him, he has converted to a new, essentially satanic religion, and we don't know why. The closest we get is that Melisandre is this really sexy, hot, red witch, and it's like, oh, well, it's kind of obvious why. But no, it's really not obvious. Like, why is he now this religious fanatic and willing to literally burn people alive for nothing? And you're like, that's such a shocking shift to go from, Robert to this guy. And it's like, he doesn't really explain why. And so it's kind of like a big mystery box with him. It's just a question mark as to what is Stannis up to. Robb and Balon and Theon, I think, do make a lot more sense, and their motivations are really well spelled out. And, Rob is much younger in the books, but we do get a sense of why he's doing what he's doing, because he's very inexperienced. He just wants to attack and things like that. So I didn't have too many issues with Rob. So the performers overall, I think did a pretty good job given the scripts they had. But I do think they kept favoring Tyrion a little bit too much to the detriment of the larger story. But that's made up with, his clashing with Joffrey. So I think there was a good back and forth with Joffrey and Tyrion, but I think the focus too much on Tyrion, they made too many scenes comedic, especially, I can't say who, but I'll just say with Arya's encounters with a few people, that seemed much more like a sitcom. It really pulled away from the show's realism about violence. Now, to be fair, they do show some really graphic things. Again, now that Westeros is at war, we do see a lot of the dark side of these various characters in the various kingdoms, but really, they still ruin it by having these really weird tonal shifts between some horror images and then back to comedy, and they really don't do a good job balancing it out. So as to why the season is so low compared to the other ones in the early seasons, I can't understand why. I mean, I think we know why it's good. It's because they're sticking to the books. I could only guess they got a better idea of how to do production and how to handle special effects and how to handle many more performers, but they are basically still struggling to adapt the books. And I'll say in closing out, I do feel sorry for them because the book does have a very weird, unique style of using this kind of weird, omniscient / unreliable narrator. And if you know the books, they're done through POV chapters of individual characters. So how you're going to be able to mix both unreliability and fallible narration as well as omniscient narration with focus on the characters in their POV chapters? Yeah, I admit, if I had to adapt this, it would be kind of a weird way to attack it. But I just think the avenues they chose, they worked out pretty well in some cases, but for the most part, it didn't work out overall. But it's not a bad season. I wouldn't call that. 6 out of 10 means 6 out of 10 of all shows, period. So from that level, you can look at it as above average, but only slightly, or that it just isn't as good as, seasons 1, 3, and 4. But I would say that you should see the second season because seasons 3 and 4 are really spectacular. They're really great. So it's kind of like a price you have to pay to get to it's kind of like crossing the bridge to get to better stories. And that's sadly it. But there are still some really great moments and some fan favorite moments, and I'll cover those up ahead. All right, so this has been GRRM Analyzed on a non-spoiler review of Season 2. If you like the content, please hit the like button and or subscribe. Thank you for listening. Please be safe.